Hey, what up, everybody? It's the Experience Collector here, Ryan Whittington, back with another video for you. I'm wearing my Funko shirt, which means I put the fun in Uncle for my nephew that I got for my birthday. And today we're going to be reading part of a chapter of Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage by Haruki Murakami. Of course, I'll be coughing throughout. I'm only going to read part of the chapter because the chapter is 26 pages long, and I don't want to bore you to death. But hopefully you find this relaxing. So here it goes, Chapter 1 of Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage by Haruki Murakami. Thank you for joining me. From July of his sophomore year in college until the following January, all Tsukuru Tazaki could think about was dying. He turned 20 during this time, but this special watershed, becoming an adult, meant nothing. Taking his own life seemed the most natural solution, and even now he couldn't say why he hadn't taken this final step. Crossing that threshold between life and death would have been easier than swallowing down a slick raw egg. Perhaps he didn't commit suicide then because he couldn't conceive of a method that fit the pure and intense feelings he had toward death. But method was beside the point. If there had been a door within reach that led straight to death, he wouldn't have hesitated to push it open, without a second thought, as if it were just a part of ordinary life. For better or for worse, though, there was no such doorway nearby. I really should have died then, Tsukuru often told himself. Then this world, the one in the here and now, wouldn't exist. It was a captivating, bewitching thought. The present world wouldn't exist, and reality would no longer be real. As far as this world was concerned, he would simply no longer exist, just as this world would no longer exist for him. At the same time, Tsukuru couldn't fathom why he had reached this point, where he was teetering over the precipice. There was an actual event that had led him to this place. This he knew all too well, but why should death have such a hold over him, enveloping him in its embrace for nearly half a year? Envelop, the word expressed it precisely. Like Jonah in the belly of the whale, Tsukuru had fallen into the bowels of death, one untold day after another, lost in a dark, stagnant void. It was as if he were sleepwalking through life, as if he had already died but not yet noticed it. When the sun rose, so would Tsukuru. He'd brush his teeth, throw on whatever clothes were at hand, ride the train to college, and take notes in class. Like a person in a storm desperately grasping at a lamppost, he clung to his daily routine. He only spoke to people when necessary, and after school, he would return to his solitary apartment, sit on the floor, lean back against the wall, and ponder death and the failures of his life. Before him lay a huge dark abyss that ran straight through to the earth's core. All he could see was a thick cloud of nothingness swirling around him. All he could hear was a profound silence squeezing his eardrums. When he wasn't thinking about death, his mind was blank. It wasn't hard to keep from thinking. He didn't read any newspapers, didn't listen to music, and had no sexual desire to speak of. Events occurring in the outside world were, to him, inconsequential. When he grew tired of his room, he wandered aimlessly around the neighborhood or went to the station, where he sat on a bench and watched the trains arriving and departing over and over again. He took a shower every morning, shampooed his hair well, and did the laundry twice a week. Cleanliness was another one of his pillars, laundry, bathing, and teeth brushing. He barely noticed what he ate. He had lunch at the college cafeteria, but other than that, he hardly consumed a decent meal. When he felt hungry, he stopped by the local supermarket and bought an apple or some vegetables. Excuse me. Sometimes he ate plain bread, washing it down with milk straight from the carton. When it wasn't time to sleep, he'd gulp down a glass of whiskey as if... when it was time to sleep, he'd gulp down a glass of whiskey as if it were a dose of medicine. Luckily, he wasn't much of a drinker, and a small dose of alcohol was all it took to send him off to sleep. He never dreamed. But even if he had dreamed, even if dreamlike images arose from the edges of his mind, they would have found nowhere to perch on the slippery slopes of his consciousness, instead quickly sliding off down into the void. The reason why death had such a hold on Tsukuru Tazaki was clear. One day his four closest friends, his friends that he'd known for a long time, announced that they did not want to see him or talk with him ever again. It was a sudden, decisive declaration with no room for compromise. They gave no explanation, not a word, for this harsh pronouncement, and Tsukuru didn't dare ask. He'd been friends with the four of them since high school, though when they cut him off, Tsukuru had already left his hometown and was attending college in Tokyo. So being banished didn't have any immediate negative effects on his daily routine. It wasn't like there would be awkward moments when he'd run into them on the street, but that was just quibbling. The pain he felt was, if anything, more intense and weighed down on him even more greatly because of the physical distance. Alienation and loneliness became a cable that stretched hundreds of miles long, pulled into the breaking point by a gigantic winch. And through that taut line, day and night, he received indecipherable messages. Like a gale blowing between the trees, those messages varied in strength as they reached him in fragments, stinging his ears. The 5 of them had been classmates at a public high school in the suburbs of Nagoya, 3 boys and 2 girls. During that summer vacation of their freshman year, they all did some volunteer work together and became friends. Even after freshman year, when they were in different classes, they remained a close-knit group. The volunteer work that had brought them together had been a part of social studies summer assignment, but even after it ended, they chose to volunteer as a group. Besides the volunteer work, they went hiking together on holidays, played tennis, swam at the Cheetah Peninsula, or got together at one of their houses to study for tests. Or else, and this was what they did most often, they just hung out someplace and talked for hours. It wasn't like they showed up with a topic in mind, they just never ran out of things to talk about. Pure chance had brought them together. There were several volunteer opportunities they could have chosen from, but the one they all chose independently was an after-school tutoring program for elementary school kids, most of whom were children who refused to go to school. The program was run by a Catholic church, and of the 35 students in their high school class, the 5 of them were the only ones who selected it. To start, they participated in a 3-day summer camp outside Nagoya and got to be good friends with the children. Whenever they took a break, the 5 of them gathered to talk. They got to know each other better, sharing their ideas and opening up about their dreams, as well as their problems. And when the summer camp was all over, each one of them felt they were in the right place, where they needed to be, with the perfect companions. A unique sense of harmony developed between them. Each one needed the other 4, and in turn, shared the sense that they too were needed. The whole convergence was like a lucky but entirely accidental chemical fusion, something that could only happen once. You might gather the same materials and make identical preparations, but you would never be able to duplicate the result. After the initial volunteer period, they spent about 2 weekends a month at the after-school program, teaching the kids, reading to them, playing with them. They mowed the lawn, painted the building, and repaired playground equipment. They continued this work for the next 2 years until they graduated from high school. The only source of tension among them was the uneven number, the fact that their group was comprised of 3 boys and 2 girls. If 2 of the boys and 2 of the girls became couples, the remaining boy would be left out. That possibility must have always been hanging over their heads like a small, thick, lenticular cloud, but it never happened, nor did it seem like even a likely possibility. Perhaps coincidentally, all 5 of them were suburban upper-middle-class families, or from suburban upper-middle-class families. Their parents were baby boomers, their fathers were all professionals. Their parents spared no expense when it came to their children's education. On the surface, at least, their families were peaceful and stable. None of their parents got divorced, and most of them had stay-at-home mothers. Their high school emphasized academics, and their grades were uniformly good. Overall, there were far more similarities than differences in their everyday environments. And aside from Tsukuru Tazaki, they had another small coincidental point in common. Their last names all contained a color. The 2 boys' last names were Akamatsu, which means red pine, and Umi, blue sea. The girls' family names were Shirone, white root, and Kurono, black field. Tazaki was the only last name that did not have a color in its meaning. From the very beginning of this fact made him feel a bit left out. Of course, whether or not you had a color as part of your last name had nothing to do with your personality. Tsukuru understood this. But still, it disappointed him, and he surprised himself by feeling hurt. Soon the other 4 friends began to use nicknames. The boys were called Aka and Ao, red and blue, and the girls were Shiro and Kuro, white and black. But he just remained Tsukuru. How great it would be, he often thought, if I had a color in my name too. Then everything would be perfect. Aka was the one with the best grades. He never seemed to study hard. He was at the top of his class in every subject. He bragged about his grades, however, and preferred to cautiously. He never bragged about his grades, however, and preferred to cautiously stay in the background, almost as if he were embarrassed to be so smart. But as often is the case with short people, he never grew past 5'3". Once he made up his mind about something, no matter how trivial it might be, he never backed down. And he was bothered by biological rules and by teachers who couldn't meet his exacting standards. He hated to lose. Whenever he lost a tennis match, it put him in a bad mood. He didn't act out or pout. Instead, he just became unusually quiet. The other 4 friends had found his short temper amusing and often teased him about it. Eventually, Yako would always break down and laugh along with them. His father was a professor of economics at Nagoya University. Ao was impressively built, with wide shoulders and a barrel chest, as well as a broad forehead, a generous mouth, and an imposing nose. He was a forward on the rugby team, and his senior year he was elected team captain. He really hustled on the field and was constantly getting cuts and bruises. He wasn't good at buckling down and studying, but he was a cheerful person and enormously popular among his classmates. He always looked people straight in the eye, spoke in a clear, strong voice, and had an amazing appetite, seeming to enjoy everything set down in front of him. He also had a quick recall of people's names and faces, and seldom did he say anything bad about anyone else. He was a good listener and a born leader. Tsukuru could never forget the way he'd gathered his team around him before a match to give them a pep talk. "Listen up," I would bellow. "We're going to win. The only question is how and by how much. Losing is not an option for us. You hear me? Losing is not an option." "Not an option," the team would shout before rushing out onto the field. Not that their high school rugby team was all that good. I was clever and extremely athletic, but the team itself was mediocre. When they went up against teams from private schools where players had been recruited from all over the country on athletic scholarships, our team usually lost. "What's important," he tells his friends, "is the will to win. In the real world, we can't always win. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And sometimes you get rained out," Kuru remarked with typical sarcasm. Al shook his head sadly. "You're confusing rugby with baseball or tennis. Rugby's never postponed on account of rain." "You play even when it's raining?" Shiro asked, surprised. Shiro knew next to nothing about sports and had zero interest in them. "That's right," Aka said seriously. "Rugby matches are never canceled, no matter how hard it rains. That's why every year you get a lot of players who drown during matches." "My God, that's awful," Shiro said. "Don't be silly. He's joking," Kuro said, in a slightly disgusted tone. "If you don't mind," I went on, "my point is that if you're an athlete, you never have to learn how to be a good loser." "You certainly get a lot of practice with that every day," Kuro said. Shiro was tall and slim, with a model's body and the graceful features of a traditional Japanese doll. Her hair was silky, lustrous black. Most people who passed her on the street would turn around and look for a second, but she never seemed to find her beauty embarrassing. She was a serious person, who above all else disliked drawing attention to herself. She was also a wonderful skilled pianist, though she would never play for someone who she didn't know. She seemed happiest while teaching piano to children in an after-school program. During these lessons, Shiro looked completely relaxed, more relaxed than Tsukuru saw her at any other time. Several of the children, Shiro said, might not be good at regular schoolwork, but they had a natural talent for music, and it would be a shame not to develop it. The school only had an upright piano, almost an antique, so the 5 of them started a fundraising drive to buy a new one. They worked part-time during summer vacation and persuaded a company that made musical instruments to help them out. In the spring of their senior year, their hard work finally paid off, resulting in the purchase of a grand piano for the school. Their campaign caught people's attention and was even featured in the newspaper. Shiro was usually quiet, but she loved animals so much that when a conversation turned to dogs and cats, her face lit up and the words would cascade from her. Her dream was to become a veterinarian, though Tsukuru couldn't picture her with a scalpel slicing open the belly of a Labrador retriever or sticking her hand up the anus of a horse. If she went to vet school, that's exactly the kind of training she'd have to do. Her father ran an OB/GYN clinic in Nagoya. Kuru wasn't beautiful, but she was eager and charming, and always curious. She was large-boned and full-bodied, and already had a well-developed bust by the time she was 16. She was independent and tough, with a mind as quick as her tongue. She did well in humanities subjects, but it was hopeless at math and physics. Her father ran an accounting firm in Nagoya, but there was no way she would ever be able to help out. Tsukuru often helped her with math homework. She could be sarcastic, but had a unique, refreshing sense of humor, and he found talking with her fun and stimulating. She was a great reader, too, and always had a book under her arm. Shiro and Kuro had been in the same class in junior high and knew each other well, even before the 5 of them became friends. To see them together was a wonderful sight, a unique and captivating combination of a beautiful shy artist and a clever, sarcastic comedian. Tsukuru Tazaki was the only one in the group without anything special about him. His grades were slightly above average. He wasn't especially interested in academics, though he did pay close attention during class and was always made sure to do the minimum amount of practice and review needed to get by. From the time he was little, that was his habit, no different from washing your hands before you eat and brushing your teeth after a meal. So although his grades were never stellar, he always passed his classes with ease. As long as he kept his grades up, his parents never inclined to pester him to attend cram school or study with a tutor. He didn't mind sports, but never was interested enough to join a team. He played the occasional game of tennis with his family or friends, and would go skiing or swimming every once in a while. That was about it. He was pretty good looking, and sometimes people even told him so, but what they really meant was that he had no particular defects to speak of. Sometimes when he looked at his face in the mirror, he detected an incurable boredom. He had no deep interest in the arts, no hobby or special skill. He was, if anything, a bit taciturn. He blushed easily, wasn't especially outgoing, and could never relax around people he just met. If pressed to identify something special about him, one might notice that his family was the most affluent of the 5 friends, or that an aunt or his mother's side was on his mother's side was an actress, not a star by any means, but still fairly well known. But when it came to Tsukuru himself, there was not one single quality he possessed that was worth bragging about or showing off to others. At least that was how he viewed himself. Everything about him was middling pallid, lacking in color. The only real interest he had was train stations. He wasn't sure why, but for as long as he could remember, he had loved to observe train stations. They always had appealed to him. Huge bullet train stations, tiny one-track stations out in the countryside, rudimentary freight collection stations. It didn't matter what kind, because as long as it was a railway station, he loved it. Everything about stations moved him deeply. Like most little boys, he enjoyed assembling model trains, but what really fascinated him were the elaborate locomotives or cars, the intricately intersecting rail tracks, or the cleverly designed dioramas. No, it was the models of ordinary stations that set down among the other parts like an afterthought. He loved to watch as the trains pass by the station or slow down as they pulled up to the platform. He could picture the passengers coming and going, the announcements on the speaker system, the ringing of the signal as the train was about to depart, the station employees briskly going about their duties. What was real and what was imaginary mingled in his mind, and he'd tremble sometimes with the excitement of it all. But he could never adequately explain to people why he was so attracted to the stations. Even if he could, he knew they would think he was one weird kid. And sometimes Tsukuru himself wondered if something wasn't exactly right with him. Though he lacked a striking personality or any qualities that made him stand out, and despite always aiming for what was average, the middle of the road, there was, or seemed to be, something about him that wasn't exactly normal, something that set him apart. And this contradiction continued to perplex and confuse him from his boyhood all the way to the present, when he was 36 years old. Sometimes the confusion was momentary and insubstantial, at other times deep and profound. Sometimes Tsukuru couldn't understand why he was included in their group of 5. Did the others really need him? Wouldn't they be able to relax and have a better time if he weren't there? Maybe they just hadn't realized it yet, and it was only a matter of time before they did. The more he pondered this dilemma, the less he understood. Trying to sort out his value to the group of people was like trying to weigh something that had no unit value. The needle on the scale wouldn't settle on a number, but none of these concerns seemed to bother the other 4. Tsukuru could see that they genuinely loved it when all 5 of them got together as a group. Like an equilateral pentagon, where all sides are of the same length, their group's formation had to be composed of 5 people exactly. Any more or any less wouldn't do. They believed that this was true. And naturally, Tsukuru was happy and proud to be included as one indispensable side of the pentagon. He loved his 4 friends, loved the sense of belonging he felt when he was with them. Like a young tree absorbing nutrition from the soil, Tsukuru got the sustenance he needed as an adolescent from this group, using it as necessary food to grow, storing what was left as an emergency heat source inside him. Still, he had a constant nagging fear that someday he would fall away from this intimate community, or be forced out and left at his own. Anxiety raised its head, like a jagged, ominous rock by the receding tide, the fear that he would be separated from the group and end up entirely alone. And that's about 15 pages. That'll do for this time. Thank you for joining me. I'm the Experienced Collector, Ryan Whittington. Have a good night.